The commercial satellite crossed over the Persian Gulf and took a photograph, just a routine pass, the kind that happens dozens of times a day. But this time, the analysts who pulled that image off the feed went quiet. Not because they saw one or two boats, not because they saw 10 or 20, because sitting in two tight formations, right in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important waterway on the entire planet, were approximately 130 Iranian attack boats. 130. And on the other side of that narrow strip of water, already waiting, already deployed, already armed and operational, were 3 full American aircraft carrier strike groups. The last time the United States had that kind of naval presence in the Middle East was 2003, when we invaded Iraq. Think about that. Think about what it means that we are back at that scale. And most Americans have absolutely no idea that the 2026 Iran war is still being fought right now, today, in water that controls a quarter of the world's oil supply. This is not a background story. This is not a footnote. This is a full-scale military confrontation that is actively reshaping global energy markets, killing sailors, and sitting one bad headline away from exploding into something none of us are ready for. And you deserve the whole truth, not the sanitized version, not the 2-paragraph summary buried beneath celebrity gossip, but the real thing. If you've been following this channel because you believe facts matter more than narratives, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is still unfolding and you need to be here when it breaks again. Let's start with what those 130 boats actually are, because the number by itself tells you almost nothing without context. These are not battleships. They are not destroyers. Most of them are small fiberglass hulls, aluminum frames, some larger patrol craft, but the majority are basically armed civilian skiffs pulled off commercial boat markets, fitted with weapons, and pointed at the most fortified naval corridor on Earth. Any one of these boats measured against a single American-guided missile destroyer isn't a fight. It's barely a contest. A modern warship would reduce a single Iranian speedboat to debris in seconds. So the obvious question is, why would Iran send them? What's the logic behind deploying a fleet of boats that can't individually win a fight against the force they're facing? Here is where we are right now as of this week, and I'm going to be straight with you because you deserve it. There is no clean ending to give you. Trump announced he was canceling a planned new wave of strikes on Iran, saying that Iranian officials and other regional governments had asked him to hold off. Reporting indicated he specifically discussed the situation with the Saudi crown prince, who raised serious concerns about the conflict spreading further into the region. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran have strong economic incentives to keep this contained. Both countries are deeply exposed to the consequences of a continued closure of the strait, and neither benefits from a war that outlasts its initial shock value and becomes a grinding economic catastrophe. Trump described the US as remaining locked and loaded, ready to act, but said he agreed to pause because a framework for a deal had reportedly been reached, one that would include the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. That optimism did not survive 24 hours. Within a day, Trump was publicly calling Iranian leadership duplicitous, after Tehran denied that direct talks with Washington had actually resumed, even as separate Iranian officials confirmed they were discussing a new transit arrangement. Through Oman, whether that framework survives this back and forth, whether it represents genuine diplomatic progress or just another pause before the next round of strikes, is right now a genuinely open question that nobody has answered. So here's what I want to leave you with, and I need you to really hear this. A strip of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point is currently determining how much you pay for gas. It's determining how nervous global financial markets get when they open each morning. It's determining whether the next headline out of the Middle East is a peace deal or the beginning of a new escalation that draws in more countries, disrupts more trade routes, and costs more lives. The 130 Iranian boats on that satellite photo weren't a random provocation that appeared from nowhere. They were Iran's answer to months of American strikes, to a naval blockade, to the destruction of over 150 of their vessels, a visible, undeniable demonstration that despite everything the United States has thrown at this conflict since February, the fleet at the center of Iran's entire asymmetric strategy is still there, still capable of massing on short notice, still capable of sending a message that a commercial satellite can catch in broad daylight. Whether that message changes anything, whether the strait actually reopens under whatever gets negotiated, or whether this pause is just the silence before another explosion, nobody watching this conflict on either side can honestly tell you they know how it ends. And that uncertainty should matter to you, not because you're a foreign policy analyst, not because you follow military doctrine, but because the price of that uncertainty gets paid at gas stations and groceries stores and heating bills by ordinary Americans who are never told clearly enough what's actually happening and why. You deserve better information than you're getting from most outlets covering this story. You deserve the full picture, not the headline, not the two-paragraph summary, not the sanitized version that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. This war is not over. The strait is not open. The deal is not done. And the next chapter of this story is coming faster than anyone in power is admitting publicly. If this kind of journalism matters to you, if you believe that people deserve the real story, unfiltered and unafraid, then subscribe right now. Share this with someone who still thinks this conflict ended months ago because it didn't drop a comment. And tell me honestly, do you think the strait actually reopens permanently under this framework? Or is this just the quiet before the next round? I read every single comment, and I will be here the moment this story breaks again, because it will break again. And when it does, you need to be ready for it. The answer is that Iran was never trying to win one-on-one. They were never trying to fight the way we fight. Military analysts have a name for this strategy. They call it the mosquito fleet. And the name explains the entire doctrine better than a 3-hour Pentagon briefing ever could. One mosquito can't hurt you, but 100 of them swarming from every direction simultaneously, moving faster than your eyes can track. Some of them real threats and some of them decoys. That is an entirely different kind of problem. That's not a military problem anymore. That's a cognitive problem, a human problem. Iran built a weapon designed not to sink American ships, but to collapse American decision-making. Because the real vulnerability of any military force isn't its armor or its firepower. It's the human being sitting in front of a radar screen, staring at 40 simultaneous contacts, trying to determine in seconds which ones are armed and which ones are bluffs. Knowing that if he's wrong in either direction, people die and governments fall. This is what military planners call asymmetric warfare. And Iran has been developing and refining it for years. They cannot outbuild the United States Navy. They cannot match our technology, our firepower, our logistics. So they didn't try. Instead, they built something specifically engineered to exploit the gap between what our weapons can do and what our commanders can process in real time. Speed replaces armor. Numbers replace firepower. Unpredictability replaces strategy. And the political cost of firing on a boat that might just be posturing, that might not actually be armed, creates a kind of hesitation that no amount of military hardware can fully eliminate. Iran found the soft spot in the most powerful navy in the world, and they've been poking it deliberately, systematically, and with increasing aggression for years before 2026 ever arrived. Here's what infuriates me about the way this story is being covered. The media treats the 2026 Iran war like it started from nothing, like it appeared out of thin air. But if you were actually paying attention to what was happening in the Gulf over the last several years, none of this is a surprise. None of it. This has been a slow-motion collision that we watched build in real time and largely chose to ignore until it became impossible to look away. Go back to 2021. Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats approached a group of American naval vessels at high speed, closing distance aggressively, until a US ship was forced to fire warning shots just to push them back. Iran immediately denied provoking anything and claimed the opposite version of events. Two governments, one incident, two completely different stories. That pattern, that specific dynamic of competing narratives where neither side fully concedes the other's account becomes the defining feature of everything that follows. Get used to it, because you're going to see it again and again. Then 2022, the US Navy released footage of Iranian boats closing to within 50 yards of an American ship. 50 yards. That is not a navigational error. That is not two vessels accidentally passing too close. That is a deliberate, calculated act of intimidation. The standoff lasted nearly an hour before flares and a horn blast finally pushed them back. US officials called it unsafe and unprofessional. Remember that phrase, because when this conflict escalated to a scale that made 2022 look like a minor incident, officials reached for almost identical language to describe something exponentially more dangerous. By 2023, an Iranian admiral was publicly bragging in front of his own commanders on Iranian state television about speedboats that forced a US helicopter carrier to ground its aircraft mid-operation. Not quietly, not diplomatically, openly, triumphantly. That same year, Iranian forces trailed an unmanned American drone boat through the entire length of the strait, every inch watched, every movement tracked, no shots fired. But the message delivered without a single word. We know every move you make in this water. So when those 130 boats appeared on satellite imagery in 2026, nobody at the Paras. Central Command looked at that photo with surprise. What they felt was recognition. This was the same doctrine, the same strategy, the same provocation, just executed at a scale that finally forced a reckoning that years of smaller provocations had failed to produce. The question we should be asking, and nobody in mainstream media seems interested in asking, is why we allowed this pattern to continue without consequence for years. Why do we treat each individual incident as isolated rather than recognizing the deliberate, cumulative escalation for what it was? That's not a military failure. That's a political failure. And it's a failure of the institutions, including the press, that should have been forcing that conversation years ago. Now let's talk about how this war actually started, because the origin story is more complicated and more consequential than most coverage suggests. Rewind to late February 2026. The United States and Israel conducted coordinated airstrikes against Iranian military targets. Those strikes were significant in themselves, but there was one outcome that changed everything. Among those killed in the first wave was Iran's supreme leader himself, confirmed within hours by multiple international news agencies. Let that land for a moment. This is not the death of a general or an intelligence officer or a proxy commander. This is the killing of the sitting supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the single most powerful figure in a political system built entirely around that one office. That is one of the most seismic events in the modern history of the Middle East, and we need to treat it with the gravity it deserves. Removing a supreme leader doesn't just eliminate one man. It triggers a succession crisis inside a system that has only ever experienced that transition once before. Iran's assembly of experts, the clerical body responsible for selecting the next supreme leader, moved with unusual speed. Within roughly a week, they named the late leader's 56-year-old son as his successor, and Iran's political and military institutions immediately pledged their backing. Analysts who've spent careers studying Iranian politics read that choice as a deliberate, defiant signal aimed directly at Washington and Jerusalem. This was not a pivot toward moderation. This was a declaration of continuity, a message that said the strikes had not achieved what they were intended to achieve, that the system was intact, that the ideology was intact, and that the response was coming. President Trump added a dimension to the story that is genuinely strange and deserves scrutiny. In an interview around that time, he said the strikes had been so effective that they had inadvertently eliminated most of the succession candidates his own administration had been tracking, the ones who might have leaned toward a more pragmatic course. In his own words, whoever Iran ended up choosing wasn't going to be anyone Washington expected, because the more obvious, more moderate candidates were already gone. Think about what that means. The United States conducted strikes so comprehensive that they accidentally removed the people most likely to eventually negotiate, and instead guaranteed that a hardliner would take the position. That is not a strategic outcome. That is a strategic miscalculation dressed up as a success. And it shaped the entire military trajectory that followed, including every boat that entered the strait in May. Iran's first major response to the strikes wasn't military. It was economic, and it was immediate. Iranian officials broadcast warnings directly over maritime radio, open public warnings telling every ship in the region that nothing was getting through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, under international law, no single country has the legal authority to unilaterally close an international strait. Britain's Navy said as much publicly, but here's the brutal reality that legal frameworks cannot fix. When active fighting is happening near a shipping lane, the difference between not legally binding and not physically safe to sail through stops mattering to every shipping company trying to protect its crew and its cargo. The legal argument is correct. It also doesn't keep sailors alive. Tankers rerouted, ships sat in port, oil prices moved within days of the closure announcement. By mid-March, hundreds of vessels were reportedly stranded near the mouth of the strait, many of them Indian-flagged. None of them willing to bet their crews' lives on whether Iranian warnings were sincere or tactical bluffing. This is the economic weapon that runs parallel to every military development in this story, and it's the one that matters most to ordinary Americans. Filling up their gas tanks, a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade moves through that 21-mile wide gap. When it closes, or even when it becomes too dangerous to reliably transit, the entire global energy market feels the shock within days. And you feel it at the pump within weeks. President Trump publicly called on nations with direct stakes in that shipping route, China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, to send their own naval assets to help secure the waterway, while making clear that American strikes on Iranian targets would continue regardless. By early April, that pressure had escalated into a direct ultimatum with a deadline: reopen the strait or face the destruction of Iranian infrastructure, with power plants and bridges named explicitly as potential targets. Iran refused to negotiate under coercion. The deadline passed. The strikes continued. Then, on April 8th, something that briefly looked like a turning point appeared. A ceasefire was reached, reportedly including a commitment from Iran to fully reopen the strait. For a few weeks, it genuinely seemed possible that this was the beginning of a resolution. It wasn't. By mid-April, Iran had resumed controlling traffic through the strait on its own terms, selectively. Unilaterally, not the full reopening that had been promised, the ceasefire didn't collapse dramatically. It just quietly stopped being real. Don't go anywhere, because what comes next is where the full weight of this conflict lands. Subscribe right now if you want to stay ahead of this story, because it is moving fast, and it is nowhere close to finished. On April 13th, the United States responded to the collapsed ceasefire by imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. This is a significant escalation beyond airstrikes and proximity standoffs. The blockade is an act of sustained economic and military pressure that puts real American sailors in real Iranian waters with real orders to stop real ships. Central Command reported intercepting dozens of vessels attempting to move through Iranian ports over the following weeks, with the total climbing past 80 within about a month. On April 19th, U.S. Marines working alongside a guided missile destroyer carried out the blockade's first direct seizure, boarding and taking full control of an Iranian-flagged vessel. This was no longer posturing. This was an active naval campaign with legal consequences, diplomatic fallout, and the ever-present risk that one confrontation goes wrong and escalates beyond anyone's plan. By early May, with the blockade squeezing hard and the ceasefire effectively dead, Iran pushed its small boat fleet back into the strait in force. Mines were part of the pressure campaign, alongside the boats. Not just a nuisance, but a genuine threat to every vessel trying to transit. Trump ordered the Navy to shoot and kill any vessel caught laying sea mines. No hesitation, no warning, no second chances. On May 3rd, he announced that the U.S. military would begin actively escorting ship traffic through Hormuz starting the very next morning. That operation was named Project Freedom, and it launched on May 4th. Iran's response to the escort operation was immediate and direct: cruise missiles, drones, and small attack boats, targeting commercial ships, and in some cases, American naval vessels directly. U.S. forces intercepted the incoming missiles and drones. Apache and Seahawk helicopters sank 6 small Iranian attack boats in a single morning. By the end of the opening days of Project Freedom, 7 Iranian boats had been sunk and a French-flagged commercial vessel had been struck. The admiral overseeing the region delivered his message to Iran without diplomatic softening: stay away from American military assets. Now understand what was already sitting in the water when those 130 boats showed up on satellite: 3 full American aircraft carrier strike groups, 12 accompanying ships, more than 200 aircraft, over 15,000 sailors and Marines. The combined military footprint of the United States Navy in that region hadn't looked like that since the eve of the Iraq War. When Iran's fast boat fleet massed in the strait in early May, it wasn't charging a handful of patrol ships. It was surging directly into a waterway already saturated with guided missile destroyers, attack helicopters, armed drones, and 3 of the most powerful floating weapons platforms ever constructed, all operating under a standing presidential order to use lethal force against mine-laying vessels without hesitation. By the time the broader campaign statistics got tallied, U.S. forces had reportedly conducted more than 13,000 strikes against Iranian targets since the war began in February. Damaging? or destroying more than 155 Iranian vessels of various types. That single number explains why Iran needed a fleet running into the hundreds, and by some of its own estimates, over 1,000 boats, just to maintain the capacity to mass again in May, after absorbing months of losses. Here is the part of this story that gets the least attention and deserves the most. The human cost that doesn't fit neatly into headlines about geopolitics and military strategy. We can talk about carrier strike groups and mosquito fleet doctrine all day, but a story about boats and satellites turns abstract quickly. And when it goes abstract, we stop seeing the actual people caught inside it. So let's be specific. Documented tracking of the broader crisis puts the toll at one tugboat, sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged. Roughly 7 of those abandoned by their crews. Meaning sailors assessed the situation and decided that their lives were worth more than the cargo and left 2 merchant ships captured outright, 12 seafarers killed or missing, 1 port worker killed, and 2 more wounded in a separate incident. These are not combatants. These are not military personnel who signed up knowing they might find themselves in a war zone. These are ordinary workers running ordinary trade routes, men who woke up, went to work, and found themselves in the middle of a naval war because the waterway they've transited dozens of times before suddenly became a geopolitical flashpoint overnight. The economic damage extends far beyond the human toll. Before this conflict began, roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas moved through the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran began restricting passage in late February, energy markets responded almost immediately. OPEC-linked countries held an emergency meeting in early April and agreed to raise production to help cushion the shock. By July, the disruption had pushed significant numbers of oil buyers toward entirely different shipping routes, fundamentally altering the economics of global energy distribution. War risk insurance premiums for vessels attempting to transit the strait climbed sharply within days of the first closures. Some underwriters stopped covering the route entirely for stretches of the conflict. And here's the brutal economic reality that shipping companies face. An uninsurable route and a physically blocked route cost a company almost the same amount of money. That is why so many operators chose to sit in port and wait, absorbing the daily cost of idled ships rather than exposing crews and cargo to a waterway that had become genuinely lethal. Every day, those ships sat idle. Every rerouted tanker, every canceled transit, those costs move through the global supply chain and eventually land on ordinary American consumers who have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. On May 6th, Trump paused to Project Freedom, citing what he called great progress toward a possible final agreement with Iran. And I want to be precise about what a pause actually means, because the framing matters enormously. A pause is not an ending. The blockade stayed in place. The underlying dispute over the strait stayed in place. What changed was the operational tempo of active fighting, not the fundamental standoff itself. Iranian state media predictably described this differently, publishing pieces claiming Iran's speedboat fleet had turned the strait into a no-go zone for American naval forces, and dismissing U.S. claims about degrading Iran's navy as hollow propaganda. Iranian officials claimed the Revolutionary Guard could field anywhere from hundreds to over 1,000 small attack boats dispersed across hardened bunkers and remote island sites, specifically engineered so that no single strike could wipe the fleet out at once. To be clear, these are Iranian government claims, not independently verified by Western reporting, and they should be treated as one side's version of events told in the way that best serves that side's interests. But to be equally fair, American officials also made claims that outran what was independently confirmed, describing Iran's navy at various points as essentially finished, effectively crippled, neutralized. The honest version of the truth almost certainly sits somewhere between two governments, each telling the story the way that flatters them most. What is backed by independent reporting is that the pause did not hold. On July 7th, the United States launched what officials described as powerful retaliatory strikes after Iranian forces attacked 3 commercial vessels transiting the strait, ships flagged from the Marshall Islands, Saudi Arabia, and Liberia. That same week, Iranian state television broadcast footage of massive funeral processions for the slain supreme leader. With mourners chanting publicly for revenge, the July escalation was serious. U.S. forces struck dozens of targets across multiple locations, including Iranian air defense systems, coastal radar installations, and missile capabilities. And in the number that matters most for understanding how central the small boat doctrine had become to this entire conflict by midsummer, more than 60 Revolutionary Guard fast boats were struck in and near the strait in a single wave of operations using fighter aircraft, naval vessels, and, for the first time in the conflict, one-way attack, sea drones, 60 boats in one operation. That's nearly 10 times the scale of the 6 sunk back in May. The Mosquito Fleet doctrine hadn't been defeated. It had become the primary battleground of the entire war. Iran did not sit quietly after July. The Revolutionary Guard announced retaliatory strikes on US-linked facilities in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Trump stated publicly that Iran had shot down an American Apache helicopter patrolling the strait, and US forces reportedly carried out self-defense strikes on an Iranian ground control station in response. Iran then launched missiles and drones toward Kuwait and Bahrain, though tracking of the conflict indicated all of them failed to reach their intended targets. The international picture complicated further. The UAE publicly declared its willingness to join a US-led effort to secure the strait, a meaningful signal from a country with enormous economic exposure to continued disruption. Iran simultaneously stood up its own Persian Gulf Strait Authority, asserting the right to regulate or close the strait entirely on its own terms. NATO stayed largely on the sidelines, preparing diplomatically for a possible support role without committing forces. The standoff had fully internationalized. Trump at one point posted publicly that he had all the time in the world to wait for a deal, arguing that the blockade was draining Iran's economy at almost no cost to the United States. When pressed by a reporter on how long he'd actually wait, his answer was 2 words: "Don't rush me." Iran called the blockade an outright act of war. Then they responded by seizing foreign commercial ships, transiting the strait, mirroring almost exactly the interdiction tactics the US had been using against them. This is the mirror image dynamic at the center of this conflict, each side justifying its escalations as responses to the other's provocations, each side telling a version of events that makes the other look like the aggressor, and the world's most important oil corridor caught in the middle while markets lurch and sailors die.